Chapter 16:16. The Fae, I repeated. She's one of them. Calypso gave a nod in the Inquisitor's direction, causing her to stiffen. The Fae used to be the predominant race on this continent, but they were eventually forced to flee because there were too many dungeons. How dare you accuse the Fae of this? The Inquisitor cried out. We're part of the Ost Republic, just like anyone. Our tribe has lived peacefully in the southeast for decades. I am not talking about the Effie who remained behind, sweetheart. Calypso's words were sweet to the point of being mocking. I am talking about the Fae from across the sea. What? The Inquisitor took a step back. The Fae who fled all drowned at sea. Everyone knows this. They found another continent, I spoke up, drawing every eye to me. The Fae built an entire civilization there after they fled. Humans are treated as slaves. They call their land the Fairy Plains, and they speak of returning to their homeland. Ferrith. Here it was the politician, who had remained silent as we spoke, but couldn't help but gasp at such a revelation. I supposed I shouldn't be too surprised. You are aware of such lore. You did suck dry the bandits' respite. Calypso chuckled. The bandits' respite was the dungeon Calypso had conquered. The original dungeon had been created for another purpose. But it got retconned by Calypso when she took over the dungeon or band became the dungeon's new master. The original story, as I came to understand it, likely had something to do with the Fae and the battle between Fae and humans. That lore was extremely old, though, even compared to Twilight Dungeon, so very little of the original lore remained. Stolen content alert. This content belongs on Royal Road. Report any occurrences. It was the DD half who had those experiences, which Calypso had assumed was where I learned about the Fae. My other half had accidentally gone to the Fairy Plains and seen the Fae directly. And it was the only reason I had managed to put it all together. I wasn't going to correct her assumption. She didn't need to know how much I knew about the Fae. That said, I had no particular hate for the Fae. When I was in the Fairy Plains, the thing went awry for a while. But my impression of the Fae was no worse than any dungeon bosses. They were a threat, but only because the lore was messed up. How could I hate them? Eliana was half Fae. I had heard about pockets of Fae that survived on this continent when the majority fled on their exodus across the impassable ocean. The Inquisitor was one of them, but the maid who had ended up having a fling with the king was another. Eliana's hair was abnormally golden, a rich yellow color, which must have come from her mother. Then again, I remembered hearing that yellow was supposed to be the color of nobles. I wasn't sure how that fits in, but Eliana was already a noble, so it probably didn't matter either way. All right. You are saying that the attacks on the pirates and the strange fog on the island are connected to the Fae, how I decided to keep the conversation on course. Why do you think the Fae would suddenly show up? Calypso seemed to be enjoying this. I don't know why I asked. But just as I did, the realization struck me. Number. The Fae want their land back. And the invasion is just beginning, Calypso smirked. Chapter 16-17. You think the Fae have sailed her from over the seas to invade Ferrith? I know that is what is happening. She responded, giving a little smirk. So, they took care of our little pirate problem. Aren't they just doing us a favor? Taking the pirates was just a matter of convenience. There were supplies, ships, slave labor, and a port that they could launch their invasion from. She shrugged. I wanted to argue more, but what she was saying was starting to make sense. With the pirate stronghold under their control, they could probably launch all kinds of attacks. At the moment, they had just been attacked feeling out our defenses. They wanted to know where we were at our weakest. But they didn't want us to think that it was something major and mobilize our forces. In a way, Prince Edward had made the right decision by treating the situation so seriously. Or they might have already landed on Aberese's shores. What about the Tearfall Isles? Why have they come down here? I demanded. They've come for the same reason anyone comes to the Champion's Gauntlet. She responded flippantly. Anyone? I frowned, and then my eyes widened. They want to complete the gauntlet and take whatever reward the dungeon master is offering. She snapped her finger. Exactly. At the end of the Champion's Gauntlet is an extremely dangerous power. The gauntlet was created a long time ago to prevent that power from falling into the wrong hands. Only someone who is determined worthy will be granted the power. The Fae seek that power, which they will use to begin their invasion on Ferrith. How do you know all of this? I asked suspiciously. There are some things that I know, and some things that I do not know. She shrugged. This happens to be something I'm very knowledgeable about. This tale has been unlawfully lifted without the author's consent. Report any appearances on Amazon. I have verified anything she has said. The Inquisitor cut in. Give me a few days, and I will know the truth of these words. In a few days, they'll have already finished the gauntlet. If they already are on the SS Island, then they might even finish it tonight, Eliana declared. Please. The islands are hardly so easy. Calypso waved her hand dismissively. Even they need to sleep and rest. They won't attempt to take the SS until tomorrow, and the CSS will take even longer than that. Then, our best option is to go to the SS boss room and wait for them, I declared. You wouldn't have a chance. Calypso chuckled. I am not so weak, I shot back. If I gathered my girls and we all worked together, I believed we could make it to the boss room. Especially if we did it before the fog appeared. Then we could plan out a trap. Calypso only shook her head. You misunderstand. No matter how powerful you are, you'll be handicapped by the dungeon. They will defeat you because they have the gauntlet's blessing. What do you mean? Have you not heard how this gauntlet works every time you beat a boss? You are awarded an enchantment? This enchantment lasts for a specific amount of time. You must collect the enchantment from the previous island before fighting the next boss. If you do not, you'll be significantly disadvantaged." "I may have heard something like that," I responded dismissively. "However, what does that have to do with them? By the time they reach you, they'll already have collected 5 of the 6 enchantments. All 6 are needed to enter the final boss room. At best, they'll initiate the battle and you'll be kicked out, forced to wait on the sidelines. At worst, the enchantments will allow them to easily overpower you and your allies. And you all die. If you want any chance of victory, you'll need to do the gauntlet." Chapter 16:18. Calypso's words didn't put me into any better of a mood. Defeat the gauntlet, fight 6 bosses. Essentially back to back, I don't have time to play some Dungeon Master's game. "It's not a game, Deke," Calypso sighed. "The very future of this continent may rest on it." I gave her a suspicious look. "What is this power the dungeon will give? Naturally, it would have to be a lore, wouldn't it?" she chuckled. "A lore dangerous enough that it could change the course of a war." "That's preposterous," the councilman spoke up. What story has that kind of power? I found myself wanting to agree with him, but I knew better. I had seen Twilight, and she had even given me a lore that allowed me to manipulate the soul itself. I knew how powerful lore could be. The right lore could turn someone who knew nothing into a powerful expert. Bad lore could cripple a nation, and good lore could lead to prosperity. If this lore even had a chance of having such power, I couldn't let it fall into the hands of the Fae. I didn't know much about the Fae, and I didn't have any hateful feelings toward them, but I knew what they thought of humans. When they weren't treating us as slaves, they feared us as monsters. I supposed, in the beginning, we were monsters. I only had a vague understanding of it, but from what I understood, when lore became large and complex enough, it could become a world unto itself. The story of a world, also known as its live stream, was a powerful and sentient thing. Everything that lived in this world was connected to its current life stream, Gaia. Gaia's original species were fairies and fairy-like creatures. This is why fairies intrinsically gathered lore and could somehow create mana. They were Gaia's servants. Some of those servants had eventually evolved into the Fae, who had started to build a civilization on Gaia. This presumably had happened after Gaia had subjugated Twilight. To the best of knowledge, Twilight's servants were the Shadow People, and the demons were their offshoot, stolen from its original source. This story is not meant to be on Amazon. Report any sightings. By the time Gaia came along, the demons were all dead and Twilight was slowly rotting away. It was only because of the war and Gaia that this planet hadn't fallen apart, much like the Twilight Dungeon. Anyway, sometime after the Fae had established themselves, dungeons had started to form, and other species from other worlds began to invade their space. This included the Animalkin, the Esmor, the Dwarves, Osterians, new demons, the Elves, and most notably the humans. After a long, brutal war, humans won out, and the reason for that was simple. We could resurrect ourselves. Our connection with Gaia was weak enough that our soul could resist Gaia, while we had time to remake our bodies and come back to life. The Fae could not do that, as their mana was too closely aligned to Gaia. They saw us as monsters at ends with Gaia, and they would stop at nothing to see us subjugated at best. If war was coming, it was bad. The best option was to take the power they were seeking and use it ourselves. I shook my head. Even if I wanted to complete the gauntlet, the doors are shut. We can't get into and counter the boss. Come on, Deke! You understand dungeons better than most, Calypso declared. Do you think a dungeon door could just remain permanently closed? I jerked at her words. She was right. A dungeon had to be completable for anyone who wanted to participate. How could the doors just be closed? Just say it, Calypso. I leaned toward her. Naturally, they were able to block the entrance, because a second one was available. And just where is that second entrance? Calypso's smile started to grow once again, and I got a bad feeling. Chapter 16-19. Let her go. That's impossible. The councilman slammed his fist down. We're not letting her go, I responded quietly. I'll have her in custody the whole time. And just who are you? He responded accusingly. I am the one who captured her in the first place. He blinked for a second. He had forgotten that. We were no longer in the dungeon. After Calypso had laid out her terms, we had gone up to the building above to speak about it. Calypso was clear in what she wanted. She would lead me through the gauntlet, but she wouldn't tell me where this alternative entrance was. This naturally led to the Inquisitor demanding that she be given a few days to break Calypso. And it all had descended into a mess. It was Eliana who had suggested we not argue in front of the prisoner and finish this discussion somewhere other than a dungeon. So, we were now in a well-lit receiving room with some boiling tea in the corner. But I didn't feel like the conversation had become any better. I was seriously considering ignoring this councilman, grabbing Calypso with Portal and leaving on our own. I didn't need his permission there. However, as I considered it, I saw Eliana's desperate eyes, and I realized that we had to do things diplomatically for her sake. I had to do it for the baby. I knew the baby had nothing to do with it, but it made me feel better when I said that enough times. Have you ever heard of any second entrance? Eliana asked, trying to redirect the conversation once again. There is no such thing. We would have found it by now. Yet, you agree that the doors are shut and that such a thing should be impossible, I cut in. He gave me a look and then sighed. From what I understand about dungeons, to even semi-permanently shut a single boss room, let alone for them, should be an impossibility. The longest obstruction I've ever seen lasted 24 hours. The Seracated boss room has been closed for at least twice that long. This story originates from a different website. Ensure the author gets the support they deserve by reading it there. Accidents did sometimes happen and dungeons could be sealed. Ototebelt had once caused an avalanche that blocked me and Lydia down in a dungeon. At the time, we had thought we were trapped permanently. Had I known it would have been gone within a day, that whole thing would have gone a lot differently. Then again, the king had once kept the boss room closed 4 months in the widow's dungeon. While a dungeon master was in combat, the door could be left closed. I believed that even in that case she had opened the door, though, and only closed someone got close to the entrance. I had once heard about an old dungeon parable. Supposedly, a man had entered a dungeon. But whenever he got near the door to the next part, the dungeon would close one door and open another. When he walked over to that door, the dungeon would switch. He was unable to progress because every time he approached a door, it was shut. But at the same time, the dungeon rule wasn't broken. There was always a means of progressing forward. The story was made as a warning. Dungeons were tricky things, and when they wanted to, they could seriously screw with a person. What the Fae had done was a trick, nothing more. The real path through the Champion's Gauntlet was still available. If we don't go through the gauntlet, the Fae will, I spoke up. And then you won't have a dungeon to rule over anymore. The choice is yours. The councilman stared at me for a moment, and then let out a long sigh. Fine, take her. I just hope you don't regret it. I was hoping the same thing. Chapter 16:20. All right, we're here. Now what? I asked. Calypso had been let free of her cage, but it was still night out. She said that timing was important, and to start the true Champion's Gauntlet, we needed to leave in the middle of the night. We had gotten as much rest as we could, and then we left while it was still dark. An extremely sleepy Chance and Cece accompanied me, as well as the girls from Titan Fall. They weren't the only ones there, unfortunately. There was another group who had butt into it. If this is some kind of trick, we will make sure to cleanse you from this world. Anne cried out. Allow me to cleanse her. I will do it quickly. The Inquisitor happily reassured her. The Inquisitor had told the Prelate Anne, and she had arrived with 5 of her creepy paladins. I wanted to reject them, but Alicia reminded me that we were planning on going up against boss after boss, in an attempt to overtake the Fae. A single esricated dungeon diving team might not be enough, so we had to take whatever help we could get. It should also be added that paladins were extremely effective in dungeons. Their skill set lead toward attacking the miasma itself, so if there was anyone by my side, a group of paladins would be it. I'd have preferred Carmen, but she was captured. As for my other girls, I had considered calling them, but I ultimately decided it was better to wait. They were all still busy. Lydia was still healing from her soul merge. Tara was still missing her original body. Miki still had her family to deal with. It seemed like they all had been through a lot lately, and I wanted to give them a few weeks at least before they had to put their lives on the line again. Why did that mean that Chance and Cece had to come? Well, I had made it abundantly clear that I was in charge. But those paladins wouldn't take orders from me. However, they would listen to Chance. if she looked at them with tearful eyes. They responded to her orders faster than Anne's orders. Her youthfulness seemed to trump seniority in their church. If she wasn't alone, the power dynamic would have shifted and it would be a problem. That's what Eliana had explained to me. I hated that I was having to play with politics inside a dungeon run, but I didn't have any choice. A case of literary theft? This tale is not rightfully on Amazon. If you see it, report the violation. The reason that Cece was along, despite being a bit older and having a bit larger of a chest, but still acceptable to the paladins, was related to her hair. Calypso had explained that this pathway would only open to those native to Gaia, i.e. fairy and fae. Cece was magically altered with fairy magic, and so her presence would open the pathway. Eliana might have worked too, but that would have meant I'd need to bring my pregnant woman along and expose her lineage. I was already uncomfortable bringing Titanfall, who should have been protecting Eliana. She insisted she didn't need it now that she was in the city, and I reluctantly agreed that the bigger danger involved this dungeon. According to Calypso, the champion's gauntlet had two pathways. The obvious pathway was the islands, but there was also a second pathway that only opened to allies of the fae. This pathway was a bit easier, which is why she believed that we could complete it. As for the fae, defeating this dungeon, they didn't appear to be aware of this easier pathway, or they probably would have taken it. I wasn't unfamiliar with such paths. A similar shortcut had existed in that laboratory dungeon in Diashin that only the dungeon master was aware of. Why did Calypso know about it? Though I had no clue. But I was getting a distinct feeling there was more to this dungeon than I originally thought. Chapter 16:21. I recognized the place we had gone. It was the same beach where I had given the dungeon master my donation. In front of was a cover leading out into a dark, murky ocean. When I had chosen this spot, it was because there were few people here. I never would have anticipated that this was the location of some hidden backdoor entrance through the dungeon. Would the dungeon master be angry now that I was going to seriously try to take their challenge? They might even consider it cheating. Hopefully, the nature of the dungeon meant they were looking for anyone who could beat it, regardless of their race. The fact that the gauntlet had an easy path for Fee and Fairy told me that the champion was probably on their side. It must have been the hero of the Fae. I had seen glimpses of lore about. That said, the dungeon wouldn't have included a second pathway if its alleged gift wasn't for everyone. I mean, it probably had no choice in the matter. But hopefully, after all of these years, it wouldn't take offense. A few minutes had passed with nothing happening, so Anne spoke up in a whiny tone. This is a complete waste of time. Just wait for it, Calypso smirked, looking up. I followed her vision, and I realized she was looking up at the sky. The sky was currently overcast. I couldn't see far enough to see whether the SS Island was still covered in mysterious fog or not. As I watched, the moon started to come out from behind the clouds. As soon as I felt the moon, I felt a strange kind of resonance. I wasn't the only one who felt this. Cece suddenly closed her eyes, as if she was feeling a gentle breeze on her. The narrative has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the infringement. A few moments later, I could feel a vibration in the ground. The vibration grew with increasing ferocity. The Titanfall girls readied themselves, while Anne grabbed onto the Inquisitor to keep from falling on her face. The next thing I noticed was a churning of water in the bay. An object started to rise from the water. As it did so, waves struck the beach, reaching our feet and soaking our shoes. I felt Chance grab onto me worriedly. But C still stood there with her eyes closed, not even seeming to notice what was going on around her. When the vibrations finally finished, a large cave entrance had seemingly risen from the water. Directly in the center of the cover, it immediately dived down into the depths of the ocean. It was hard to say how it wasn't filled with water because the entrance did not appear to contain any cover. Yet, the pathway did look dry. There was a stone path leading straight to it, so you didn't need to swim out there. Under the light of the moon, it had a somewhat surreal appearance. As the last of the tremors faded, Cece opened up her eyes. She made a surprised noise as if she only just realized a cave entrance had suddenly appeared. Everyone else exchanged looks. There was a hidden entrance. The only way one could enter it was to have a fairy or fae present in the moonlight. It was no surprise why it had never been stumbled upon before now. "Shall we go?" Calypso asked, a knowing smirk on her face. Chapter 16:22. Our goal was simple. We had to enter the Hidden Champions Gauntlet and beat the fae to the end. With the challenge and difficulty lower than the surface dungeon, plus the combined efforts of several paladins, a prelate, an inquisitor, an Austerian S-class party, and myself, I had the confidence that we'd be able to defeat it. With luck, we'd be back just in time for the peace talks. As for those talks, Eliana was confident she could unite the Ost Republic. All it would take was exposing the threat from overseas, and most of the Ost Republic would unite instantly. I said most because there was one group that was in a hard place. The fae that lived in the Ost Republic had managed to remain there for generations. They had believed their brethren had fallen. And the feeling was mutual. I hadn't even known the fae still lived down here until I had come down here. They had done a good job keeping their tribe low-key, as did most of the tribes of the Ost Republic. If a war was brewing, Eliana didn't want the fae who was from the Ost Republic to feel like they were enemies. I recalled many wars in history where people were treated poorly simply because they were the race of the enemy invaders. That hadn't been the case in Chom when Dayashin attacked, and I hoped it wasn't the case now. This was the other reason it was so essential that Eliana stayed behind. Once word of the fae invasion came out, people from Ost would start panicking. Some might even lash out at friends and minorities. Humans might flee to Aberys, where they would feel safer. It could potentially divide the Ost Republic completely and create the perfect place for the fae to conquer and start their invasion on the mainland. The narrative has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. Thus, we were both fighting this battle in our way. Eliana would be preparing people and making alliances, while I would make sure they couldn't get their hands on this weapon. Unfortunately, this was just the start. If this was an invasion, we had a long way to go. I had a feeling I would need to call on all of my girls. And maybe even my dungeon's strength. But the time this was all over, I would give them as much time as I could before then. And that's why we had to give it our best. Chance and Cece followed close behind me as we crossed the rock path. The paladin and church girls came second, and the Titanfall trailed in the back. Calypso was in chains, and she was placed behind me and in front of the paladins. I took the lead because I had map and all of the danger senses. I guess Titanfall also had dungeon diver jobs, as Elysia had explained to me. But I was more comfortable taking the lead until we had a better sense of what this dungeon was about. As soon as we passed the entrance, there was a long stairway heading into the dark. I started moving down it, but I could not see the bottom. The Titan's fall had only just started heading down the stairway when the rumbling began again. The cave was lowering back into the depths. This time, Cece could feel it and grab onto me frightfully. I readied a portal just in case water started coming down, but the water didn't enter the cave. When the rumbling stopped, I looked up at the others, who were all in various states of alarm, all except Calypso, who was still grinning mysteriously. "Let's get this over with," I spoke out loud. We continued down into the depths of the dungeon path. Chapter 16, 23. The stairway continued down for some time, but we eventually reached the bottom. This opened up into a long hallway underneath the water. This would be the equivalent of the first level for this champion's gauntlet. The miasma was far thicker down here, and much more similar to what I was used to from a dungeon. "The monsters on the islands form down here?" I asked. "Quite observant," Calypso chuckled. "As expected from a fellow master. Yes. The surface miasma is far too low for monsters to be created. One could say that this is the true dungeon where the magic is made. The miasma is vented onto the island, and the monsters follow along with it." "Does that mean we'll be encountering more monsters down here, or less?" I asked. "I wonder. Calypso? Do you usually require so much information before entering a dungeon? Isn't it better to just figure it out on your own? I could always be wrong." After all, I did tend to go into dungeons blind. Sometimes I would buy a map to copy into my map skill, but otherwise, I did very little research. This was not the norm. For most people, a trip into a dungeon was a major event that requires weeks if not months of preparation. A single level often took days to defeat, and there were 5 levels in between safe rooms, presuming you could even find the next one. For those dungeons that were well documented, they would study upon them. Hire guides like Reza had once been, get maps, take testimonials, and even then, go in with full supplies. when they were venturing into parts unknown, it was even more serious. One had to account not just for camping in a potentially dangerous place filled with monsters, account for complete darkness, a need for food, water, and the potential for a need to suddenly escape. But they also had to deal with the miasma weighing down on them, something I took for granted these days. This story has been taken without authorization. Report any sightings. It was clear that Titanfall was uncomfortable diving into an unknown part of this dungeon without any prior reconnaissance. They were experts on dungeon diving, and also the ones most vulnerable to dungeons. The church had its defense against miasma. Calypso was a miasmic creature. I had a god soul. Cece and Chance were immune. Cece had been altered by my dungeon and Astria, while Chance had been altered by Roth. I had learned when I absorbed his lore that forcing young people to be exposed to dungeons regularly helped them build up an immunity to miasma. He had done this with every girl intended for his harem, so the lionesses, while not protected in the same way my slaves were, still had a high resistance to miasma. So, it turned out Titanfall was at the greatest disadvantage here. The only reason they weren't complaining about it was because of Elysia. I am sure they would have done things differently. And much more carefully. I realized that my methods truly looked reckless to an outsider. I knew I had access to Portal, slave communication, and my soul world, among other things. I had True Dungeon Diver as a job, and had many different skills like map, tracking, detect traps, and sense danger, which allowed me to navigate it safely. When I needed to escape it, I could do that just as easily. "Stay close," I ordered, and then continued. Chapter 16, 24. The pathway did not seem to deviate by much. There were no turns or maze, like dead ends. It reminded me of Graham's passageway. Although while that was a massive cavern with the room to move a full cart and horses through, this path was a hallway only large enough for two people to stand abreast. If we did end up having to fight, one person would have to take on the brunt of the battle, while the others would be trapped in the back, only able to support. This was one of the reasons I wasn't too worried about having Cece and Chance right behind me. Of course, accidents could always happen. This might have worried me, but I also had one other trick up my sleeve. I could do a position shift with anyone in my party. I made sure I was at a party with the Titanfall girls. If push came to shove, I could instantly teleport to the back of the line and bring one of them to the front. This was something Elysia and I had discussed with them ahead of time. Thus, I remained on the lookout for any red enemies, ready to take them out quickly so we could continue onward. If I got overwhelmed, I could fall back into a supporting role, which was arguably always had been my forte. I remained in that state for some time, but nearly an hour of walking later, and we didn't come up against a single enemy. I finally approached a large doorway to the side of the hallway. There was a 1 written on it. The tale has been taken without authorization. If you see it on Amazon, report the incident. We're there. Calypso announced in a chipper voice. "What do you mean? We're here," I shot back. "I thought you said the monsters spawn here." "They spawn, and then they leave." She shrugged. "They don't hunt these hallways." "How is this a gauntlet? You said it would be easier. But this is like the dungeon isn't even trying." "You still need to defeat the 6 bosses, don't you?" She shot back. I let out a breath, deciding it wasn't worth arguing with her. She could have told me that there wouldn't be any enemies. I wouldn't have been stressing out for the last hour. In retrospect, this was probably for the best. How could we catch up or surpass the Fae if we didn't have an advantage that was at least this much whatever? I just wanted to get this over with. "Cece, Chance, stay back here," I declared. "What? No! If you wish to enter the dungeon room from this direction." "Cece will have to be a member of your party," Calypso declared. I clenched my teeth for a second, but there was nothing I could do. With a sigh, I gave a nod. I wasn't going to leave Chance out here alone. She was even younger than Cece. I did want them to get some experience. I guess it had to end up this way. Fighting bosses in a dungeon. Let's go. I shoved open the door, heading into the first boss room of the Champion's Gauntlet. Chapter 16, 25. This place looks creepy. Chance clung to the back of my shirt. Wasn't she supposed to be my bodyguard, given her age? I was happier if she stayed behind me rather than racing off into dungeons. As far as escort missions go, she had so far been better than most. Although now that I was looking around, I had to agree. The back hallways had a utilitarian feel, but this boss room looked like a cave. The pillars rose into the blackness, and there were a lot of dark corners to hide in. I was pretty sure the boss was in one of them because I didn't see it anywhere else. Cobwebs were floating in the darkness, and the sound of something suspicious was moving in the dark. I could feel both girls grabbing on to me. I had a feeling there would be some reveal event. Some boss monsters just sat and waited, but others liked to make a flashy entrance. I was guessing this was going to be one of the flashy ones. Predictably, it was only once I reached near the center and the last person had entered the room that the boss door slammed shut, and the torturing began to turn on one by one in a menacing way. As they lit up, I started to get a better look at the area around us. It was webs. The entire room was covered in webs. That only meant one thing. As the final torches turned on, a large black creature began to lower to the ground. It had enormous fans and 8 long spindly legs that came out from a fat black body. It was taller than me, a massive spider. "Hey, I hate spiders!" Cece cried out, leaping onto my back. "It's too big," Chance whimpered. "Someone kill it?" Reading on this site, this novel is published elsewhere. Support the author by seeking out the original. We'll stop it. There was a sudden chorus of shouts just as I opened my mouth to speak. Before I could move a step forward, the group of paladins blew past me. They all descended on the spider like a wave of maniacs. Even it seemed startled by their sudden aggression. They didn't hold back a single hit. using powerful paladin light spells as they slammed their shields and swords into the spider. It let out some screeches. But at the end of the day, this was only the Sea Island boss. It was quickly torn limb from limb. The battle ended in only a few minutes when the screaming topped. The men had a few small wounds, but I didn't offer to heal them. They could have probably avoided all of those had they not acted so recklessly. As they finally left the spider's corpse, one of the paladins fell to his knee in front of me, looking at the two girls with a creepy smile on his face. "We took care of the spider for you, my beauty," he declared. "Eek! Chance hid behind me even more. Save me, my lord." He didn't even do anything, though. The knight glared at me. Why wouldn't she be frightened? "You are covered in spider guts. You are terrifying," I shouted, giving him an accusing look. He looked down at himself, and then at the other paladins who were also covered in spider gunk, and he made a horrified sound before running to Anne, who quickly scolded all of them as she healed them. I felt a bit more relieved, though, that it turned out that these men who were too dangerous to be around children were actually secretly pretty bad with them. At least there was still a balance to this world. Chapter 16:26. After defeating the boss, both doors opened back up. Whatever the Fae had done to keep the door closed had seemingly reset itself upon the death of the dungeon boss. I just wish I understood how they did it. The Free seemed to have a better understanding of dungeons than even I did. I supposed that made sense in some ways. After all, they had been dealing with dungeons as their mortal enemy for many years. They had to have picked up a few tricks along the way. I left most of the group in the boss room while I went into the safe room. As long as they stayed there, the boss room wouldn't reset. Once we left, the doors would close again and would open in a few hours after the boss regenerated. I wasn't sure if the door to the safe room would reopen, or if whatever trick they used only made the exception in this particular instance of the boss being defeated. Thus, I decided I would hurry. It would be a shame if the door closed behind us and I was stuck on the wrong side permanently. The door wouldn't be able to open again until another moonlit night. Just looking at the entrance to the safe room, I could see that the night was nearly over and the sun would be coming up soon. I made sure to register with the kiosk just in case, and then my eyes landed on the mosaic. It was the mosaic that was the main reason I told everyone to wait up. "That's pretty," Cece spoke up next to me. Chance and Cece had been the ones to follow me into the safe room. I admitted that I was quite curious about this dungeon. Now that I knew it held so many secrets, I was more eager to learn about them than I had been original. Since I had to go through all of the bosses anyway, I wanted to make sure I understood as much of the story as I could. Unlawfully taken from Royal Road, this story should be reported if seen on Amazon. "What does it mean?" Chance asked. "It's confusing. The dungeon mosaics were just one or more images referring to a part of the story. They didn't necessarily exist in order, and most of the details on them had been lost with time. The people were often faceless, only providing you enough context to pick out the kind of person they were. Even their sex was often obscured unless they were wearing a dress or something obvious. After that, it was all guesswork. I had found I was particularly good at guessing, but even if I guessed the lore being told from the dungeon, there was still another problem. The dungeons were sometimes wrong. Their very nature corrupted lore. So it only stood to reason that the longer they remained, the more degraded the lore would become. Things that were once princesses became giants, and honest men became foul beasts. I wondered what that spider we had just killed represented. It could have been a house spider someone accidentally stepped on, which with time had grown larger and larger until it was as big as a horse. These kinds of exaggerations, inaccuracies, and even deceit came with any story. It reminded me of a few chain letters. One person would send the letter, and each retelling caused the story to be grander and more abstract. It was just that in dungeons, these kinds of stories became reality. "Master, what does it mean?" Cece asked. It had been some time since I had last articulated my thoughts on a dungeon story I had encountered. I remembered a time when Lydia, Miki, Celeste, Tara, and Shao would all sit down and patiently wait as I weaved a story out of a handful of images. With these literal children, I'd guess I had to give it another go. Let's see. It starts with a war. Chapter 16:27. I started by explaining the beginning of the war between the Fae and the humans, or at least what I knew about it. None of that was in the mosaics, but I didn't think the mosaic would make any context without the context the story is being told in. I was pulling together things I had heard from many different sources, and even then, it was just my best guess. This mural started by showing a growing group of dark, shadowy creatures pushing back the Gaia's people, the Fae, over and over again. Those dark, shadowy creatures would be humans and any other creatures that crawled out of dungeons. The Fae had fled to these islands, where they started digging for something. They had seemingly found that thing. One of the Fae, a woman with long blonde hair, was holding up some kind of glowing white light. It was impossible to tell what it was, but I guessed it was the power. To change the course of the war, she knew she must use this power on her enemies. In using that power, though, she would destroy herself in the process. She had to choose to become the very thing she despised. I finished. I had added that last part for effect. I assumed that using the power would have some kind of bad end, or there wouldn't have been a dungeon here. She might have never got to use the power, but if she didn't use it, why didn't it fall into human hands? As for the talk about becoming what she despised, that was just fluff talk. No one wanted to be a mass murderer, right? Sometimes you had to make a choice you'd regret. And what did she choose? Cece asked. This text was taken from Royal Road. Help the author by reading the original version there. Did she use the power? Chance added. I don't know. I sighed. There are other murals I haven't seen. This is only the second one from this dungeon that I have observed. As soon as we get to the next one, I can tell you more of the story. My lord, we must continue, Chance cried out. Yes, master, we need to see more. Both girls had suddenly become insistent. I didn't think I was that good of a storyteller. Sour. But what was it about girls when I started reading the murals? I gave a short nod. And they voiced their excitement before running back into the boss room. I went to follow them, taking a few steps before I stopped and looked back at the mural one last time. Those murals were never particularly detailed, but there was something about that woman holding the shining bright light. She felt vaguely familiar to me. Was I feeling it with my eyes? Or was my mana sense detecting the intent of the lore? Did it destroy you? I whispered. Half to myself. There are many ways to destroy yourself, Deke. A voice caused me to look up and see Calypso standing there. I opened my mouth to say something, but the paladin holding her chains pushed past. What is taking so long? I am sorry. We wanted my lord to explain things to us for a bit. Is that a problem? Change spoke from behind, looking up at the paladin eerie-eyed. And not at all. It's all fine. His moody treatment of me was immediately changed to smiles for her. He returned to the boss room, dragging Calypso with him. And I followed close behind. Chapter 16, 28. After leaving the boss room, the door shut behind us. As soon as it shut, a rune-like inscription on the door I hadn't seen before started to glow. I could feel it giving off some kind of mana signature. I reached for it instinctively, and when my finger touched it, there was a flash and I could feel some kind of spell settling over us. When the light faded, I did feel a bit more strength and energy. As everyone was looking around in confusion, I noticed a marking on Chance's arm. As I reached out to get a closer look, I realized there was the same marking on my arm. I glanced at it, and I immediately recognized what it was. Blessing it looked like the blessings, except this one was incomplete. Where my blessings were written in some strange script that wrapped around my arms, legs, shoulders, and back. This appeared to be extremely short, just a few of those illegible words. This was the supposed buff you got as you went along. Each one was a copy of a piece of the blessing. And only after getting all 6 do you complete the blessing and gain access to it. Did that mean that this power Calypso spoke of was some kind of blessing? I dislike being marked by a dungeon. It itches. Anne scratched at her arm irritably. Please bear with it, prelate. The mark of power goes away after a month or so. The Inquisitor reassured her. It'll go away instantly once someone completes it, Calypso spoke up. Only one person gets to keep the prize. I wonder who it will be. This story is posted elsewhere by the author. Help them out by reading the authentic version. What did they dig out of the ground? Calypso, I asked. How should I know? She responded with a smirk. I was starting to have some theories, but I didn't know if they were true. Calypso was the kind of person who relished in misinformation, so who knew what was true and what wasn't? Ground? What ground? Anne demanded. I shook my head. letting out a sigh. This dangerous power. The one the Fee are after. I think they tried to use it once before. I think it failed, and that's what created this dungeon. There was some kind of power they dug up. Another dungeon. So, this mark is related to that power, and seemed to reason out. Looking down at her arms slightly differently, it was clear by that look that Anne liked power. If she was the one who got the power, what would she do with it? Well, we didn't even know what it did. But I had a feeling she'd use it on the Church of the Mother. No, Anne and the Church couldn't get that power. Ever since I met Mary, I hadn't considered them a threat, but they were still capable of a great deal in this world. The Church, even if it was a different church back then, had been responsible for the fall of the Fae. And they also had some relationship to that clockwork dragon I had encountered so long ago. No matter how much lore I absorbed, there were always more pieces to the puzzle. Let's just get to the next boss fight. I was wasting time dwelling on things when I could just continue and find the answers. It was time to fight the second boss. Chapter 16:29. The theme of the boss is seemed to be creatures of the wild. I suppose that it made it easier when they died. Every time a boss died, their lore took a blow. The new version of themselves that replaced the old would be a bit weaker and more foolish. It wasn't that hard to understand. The longer someone lived, then the more experience they'd gain. As they were exposed to the miasma of the dungeon, they would also grow more powerful too. This was why some dungeons could be so uneven, especially when it came between the difficulty of the final boss and the other bosses. The lower you got, the longer it had been since a boss was defeated. Those bosses remained around longer, growing more and more powerful until they eventually became sentient beings with miasmic souls. Well, it wasn't that easy to form a miasmic soul spontaneously, but it was far more likely on a long-lived boss over a brand new one. In the Great Labyrinths, as they were called after you went down about 50 floors, the top dungeon divers had encountered a wall they couldn't pass. It was a boss who had been undefeated for long enough that his skill and ability were undefeatable. Once a capable team defeated him once, it would break the bottleneck. Weaker teams would be able to defeat his now weaker form. And the progress in the dungeon would move another 10 levels until the next major roadblock. If enough time and luck went by that a boss wasn't defeated and grew to be too powerful, then they'd lose progress. This was the tug and pull that happened around the Great Labyrinths. And it was part of the reason I never had a straight answer on how far the dungeon divers had made it. Some rumors claimed they had made it 70 stories, while others claimed 50 was the farthest anyone had achieved. The Champion's Gauntlet would be considered a 70-level dungeon if the islands had been converted to floors. This would be the most difficult dungeon I had ever versed. Enjoying this book, seek out the original to ensure the author gets credit. However, it wasn't quite as bad as Die Ridge for various reasons. The first 10 floors, or Island 1, were completely boss free and existed as a seeming staging area for convenience, as well as the entrance to the hidden pathway for the Fae. The way the dungeon was formed with islands, the more difficult boss on the fifth island could be defeated regularly, so they never built up to be too difficult. The one exception was the final boss, who had never been defeated. In our case, the bosses would have each been just defeated, making the new bosses their relative weakest. One way to sidestep was to choose bosses whose ability was never dependent on intellect. A boss that was purely physical power and anger would still be strong, even after a recent death and reincarnation. I decided that this two-headed bear we had to fight fit along with those. He was extremely powerful, and while avoiding him wasn't too difficult for me, I was also needing to protect Cece and Chance. Meanwhile, the paladins took the brunt of the beating. It was eventually one of the Titanfall girls who delivered the final strike, severing his head. After the battle, everyone was a bit battered, and I had to heal them quickly. We were only at the equivalent of a level 20 boss, and we were having this much trouble. I hoped we could keep it up to the final boss. Chapter 1630. Before we could leave the second boss, I naturally made sure to check out the safe room. At this point, it was light outside. I looked outside very briefly to see if I could see the progress of the fog, but I was still too far. It was feeling the pressure of time on us. Back in the safe room, the girls were already sitting and waiting for me to continue to the story. I wasn't sure that a single mural would add very much to what I already knew. This mural seemed to be dedicated to talking about the Fae hero. It occurred before the second mural, but my best guess. And it seemed to be about her rise to power. She fought against the forces of darkness valiantly and was heralded by all of the Faes as the great hero. The last part of the mural displayed her killing the Demon King. If the shadowy creatures were this dungeon's interpretations of humans, then wouldn't it be a human king? He seemed to be powerful. And they had a triumphant battle. He died, and she seemed to be wounded in some way, although it wasn't clear in what way. It showed her hitting her head just after delivering the final blow. Of course, I didn't deliver the story to the girls as the enemy hero slaughtering humans. It was a pretty cringy story when taken from the humans' point of view. Thus, I told it to them from the Fae perspective. To the little girls, it sounded much like the battles already going on in the north. The demons were the dark, shadowy characters that came from the dungeon, and humans were those that fought valiantly to keep them at bay. It was a familiar story to them, and one they were able to grasp. This narrative has been unlawfully taken from Royal Road. If you see it on Amazon, please report it. Although the wise and beautiful hero was able to defeat the Demon King, it was already too late. They had no choice but to flee. I ended the story like that, before the girls could say anything. I heard the clapping of 2 hands. We all turned to the door to see Calypso standing there, her hands still in chains. The paladins had wanted to spy on the girls during store time and had come in to listen to the story. Nope, wait. 3 little girls were sitting in front of me listening to the story. When did Anne get there? Why was she sitting crisscross like a child? It was almost like you were there. Calypso declared as she stopped clapping. Are you sure that you are not the hero that they spoke of hardly? I am just telling a story, I responded. How could I be the hero? Whoever knows how long someone else's story reaches? She responded cryptically. I wonder how far back your story goes. Not very far, I shot back. But I felt some unease from her words. It felt like she knew something she wasn't saying, and not something about this dungeon, but something about me. How did I end up in this world after all I knew where my story began? But I couldn't help but wonder where was my story heading. Let's go get the next piece of the blessing. Chapter 1631. When my soul bonded with a blessing, I would gain the knowledge within that lore. Looking at the second piece of blessing attached to my skin, I couldn't say the same. This blessing was only skin deep. It didn't contain the lore or the knowledge yet. It contained a little bit of the dungeon's energy, which was why people who had them were stronger. But that was it. I wish it would tell me the story, so I could understand what this grand war-changing weapon would be. Yet, as I found with all of these dungeons, the only way you could find the answers was to keep walking forward. We left the second boss room shortly after getting the blessing and then headed on to the third. I could occasionally hear the shout of a monster in the distance. The hallway carried echoes well, so it gave the entire route a scary feel to it. One would be excused for feeling like there were monsters all around them ready to leap at a moment's notice. If I didn't trust in my sense life, I would have been terrified. As was, everyone else was on full alert. The 2 girls clung to me whenever there was a roar in the distance. Every monster that was formed in the thick miasma of the corridors seemed to leave before reaching us. They never appeared in front of us, although I had read in one book that the existence of mana being disturbed the local miasma, making it difficult for monsters to coalesce. I found myself dwelling on this as we walked, and that led me to wonder if one could increase the miasma in an area by continually stirring it with mana, allowing it to get ultra-concentrated. I already knew blowing miasma under a lake could eventually cause the lake to become a miasmic pool of death. So what other tricks were there? This tale has been unlawfully lifted without the author's consent. Report any appearances on Amazon. We reached the third boss room, with CC at the front. The door opened just like all the others. We entered the room, and sitting there was another beast. This one was some kind of giant boar. By giant, I meant that it was the size of a house. Intelligence wasn't needed when you had tusks that big. The boar charged immediately, and the group scattered as it slammed into the spot we had been standing. I was holding 2 girls, one in each arm. Why did you grab me? I would have gotten him, Chance cried out. I hate them. Pigs are really dirty, Cece added. Just stay out of the pig. Ah. Borsway, okay? I asked in a no-nonsense voice as I put them down. I turned back and went after the boar. The thing had a lot of health, and it was difficult getting it down. The most effective spell turned out to be one of Anne's. She held up her hands and cast it while the paladins were knocked around left and right. When it landed, the boar took massive damage, eventually collapsing in death. As it disappeared, a particular drop appeared. It was a massive slab of pork meat. Tasty? Chance had come out of hiding and was staring at the slab with drool coming down her mouth. "We don't have time to break and eat," I told her, causing her expression to sink. That's when I heard a rumbling sound from someone's stomach. I turned to find it was Anne, who was looking at me desperately. "We're not!" The paladins, seeing two girls in distress and me the apparent cause, gave me deathly stares. "Fine. I guess we could afford to take a little lunch break." Chapter 1632. "Is everything okay, Master?" Alicia asked. "I hope everyone is enjoying the meal." It's top-notch. My lord cooks the best." I see. Everyone had been eating quietly. I was getting a bit spoiled by Eliana's overreactions. Not everyone could be so pleased with roasted boar. I just didn't know if anyone liked it because they weren't convulsing on the floor with foam coming out of their mouth. That didn't seem healthy either. Maybe I needed to take Eliana to a doctor in my world after all. I had ended up cooking the boar meat drop and everyone enjoyed it. Dropped items were an odd thing in dungeons. They sometimes could give you access to rare items that you couldn't find anywhere else. Since dungeons used lore, it was theoretically possible to bring things back that no longer existed. Exotic plants, strange animals, and more could be seemingly resurrected through the power of a dungeon. Of course, most animals would be tainted by the miasma of the dungeon. Items didn't appear to be tainted in the same way. I didn't know why they were able to avoid this fate. Other than that, they existed to entice people to enter the dungeon and potentially become its next victim. Whether the dungeon hungered for the lore they could potentially steal off anyone who died, or the mana that they could convert into miasma to fuel their continued growth, I had no clue. It was probably a good thing that items were tainted with miasma, or food like the meat we just ate would slowly turn us into miasmic creatures. Stolen content warning: this content belongs on Royal Road. Report any occurrences. That didn't stop Anne from casting some kind of purification spell over the meat before I cooked it. I had similar spells, and they had nothing to do with miasma. I usually only used such spells to keep food lasting longer without spoiling. The paladins who looked admiringly at and didn't know this, though. It seemed like the church had adopted a lot of customs that didn't do anything, but were ultimately for show. The only one who seemed to refrain from eating was Calypso. When I offered her something, she refused and then made an offhanded comment about how she had to watch her figure. While everyone else ate, she remained sitting in the corner, her chains still on and being held by a nearby paladin. I allowed the paladins to be in control of the chains, but I still kept a close watch on her. If one of them decided to suddenly make a move on her, I wanted to be ready. That's why I noticed when her eyes suddenly widened. It was something no one else noticed, but there was something that had suddenly caught her. I had already eaten, so I didn't hesitate to walk over and crouch next to her. "What is it?" I demanded. Calypso looked at me reluctantly for a second and then sighed. "We need to hurry. We're already past the third dungeon. We've made it halfway, and we've only been traveling half the day. Why do we need to hurry? It's the Fae," she responded. "They've just defeated the SS, Brigade Boss." Chapter 1633. "How can you be certain of that?" I asked. "I know what I know," she snapped back before turning her head away. "I just happen to know that the dungeon boss was just defeated. You should be able to see SS Ayland from here. It won't be covered by the fog any longer." I had the paladins watch her as I went up through the Sappha room and then out onto the island. I jumped up into the sky to get a better look. I was on the A Island now. Esseland had been the one I went to the previous night, and SS should be just beyond that. As I looked into the distance, I could see that Calypso was indeed right. The SS Island was no longer surrounded by fog. If I squinted hard, I was pretty sure that fog was starting to form around the SS Island too. With a curse, I went back into the Sappha room. Chance, Cece, and Dan had all made their way there, sitting down and ready for story time. "We don't have time for this. They're going to be fighting the final boss soon." So soon one of the Titan Fall girls cried out. I thought Calypso said that it would take them a long time. I think the problem with that sentence was Calypso said. One of the other girls whispered in her ear. I realized it as soon as I said it. Calypso had been dragged along with the paladin, and she shot them a glare, but the taller women ignored it. The little girls looked disappointed, but they got up and started heading back to the champion's gauntlet. The paladins gave me dirty looks for making the girls sad. I ignored them. You could be reading stolen content. Head to the original site for the genuine story. Knowledge is power, Deke. Calypso spoke up as the group filed out. You may want regret shunning it. I didn't know what she meant for a second. But when I glanced in her direction and looked at the mural, I saw a piece of the story I didn't expect to see. What I had to look twice to make sure I caught it right. That can't be. It showed the woman with golden hair. She was the one who was the champion of the Fae. In the last image, she had been using some kind of power against the monsters of darkness. However, this mural showed her in clothing that didn't look all that different from the clothing of Earth. There were tall buildings and skyscrapers. In the next image, she was overtaken by a bright light. When she woke up, she was in front of a king, the king of the Fae. They would train her, make her stronger. And then she'd eventually rise to fight off the Demon King. It came off as the classic story from an isekai. But it was being told in this dungeon, and in connection to the champion who fought against the humans. It was a human king that she battled, and as for the mysterious champion who saved the Fee the Champion, is a hero from another world. Chapter 1634. Technically, all of humanity was from another world. Few races on this world actually started on this world. Most of them burrowed their way through dungeons to get here. Dungeons, when they became deep enough, could act as pathways between worlds. Either that or they were just copies of the lore from a world that had been destroyed. Like a malignant tumor throwing off flecks of cancer that scattered across the various worlds. I had never entered a dungeon deep enough to find out which was the truth. However, this was the first time I had ever heard of someone being summoned to another world. At least, this was the first time someone other than myself had been summoned. What was even stranger was that this woman wasn't working for humans. Maybe that was a bit prejudiced of me as a human. But I had expected if I ever found someone from another world, that it would be the humans they were fighting for. In their desperation, the Fee had managed to summon a champion from another world. This new information was enough to send my mind whirling through the possibilities. I happened to know a key fact about the Fae. That fact was that the Fae Royals had yellow hair, just like this woman. I had long theorized that this champion was in some way connected to the Fae royalty. I figured that the champion was some princess hero or relative of the royal family. It wasn't hard to guess that someone would need to have a lot of resources if they wanted to become strong enough to be called a champion. If you find this story on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen. Please report the infringement. However, the king in this mural did not have yellow hair. Perhaps the yellow-haired lineage that continued in the fairy plains was the descendants of this hero. The true royal family must have been destroyed, and the survivors reformed around this champion. This meant that she wasn't just the hero, but she was also the matriarch of the entire Fae Royal structure. I shook my head. I was getting distracted. When I looked back to where Calypso had been standing, she had already left. Being dragged by the paladin, the group filed out of the boss room and we gained the third part of the blessing. Without wasting any more time, we started heading for the next fight. This was the S-Ricarded monster. We were starting to get into the difficult bosses here. My only hope was that the SS-ranked island would be difficult enough that we could catch up with the FI. It had taken them a little over half a day to get through the SS, while it had taken us half a day to get through C2A. Presuming SS will be a little harder for them, I didn't know for certain which of us would reach the boss room first. That led to the other question. If they reached first, could we still enter through the back door? It was going to be close. Chapter 1635. We began to move at a brisker pace. After going so long without running into a mob, I became a bit bolder with our progress. I kept the map and life sense running just in case. But I no longer kept my eyes out for traps or ambushes. We quickly made our way to the S-Class boss room. And after it opened, thanks to Cece, the group of us prepared for the fight. Before this, we had been walking in suddenly and without preparation. After the last fight, which had been a bit difficult, it was time we started making plans. Of course, it seemed like the Titans' fall and the church didn't plan to work together very much. It wasn't that they were necessarily antagonistic to each other. Although the Austerian women typically had larger chests that offended the small-chested church, a source of continuous contention, I decided that it would be better if the two teams were given different jobs. Thus, I assigned the Austerian girls a tanking position. Their job would be to keep the monster on themselves. The church would focus on heavy damage, while I and the girls would focus on providing the two groups support. That support started before the battle began. I cast various armor and shield spells on everyone to support them before the fight. There was a time back in the day where I couldn't go a single battle without buffing everyone in my party. It was funny how things changed. The group entered the S-Class boss dungeon room. I was very curious about what we were going to end up fighting when the first step into the room told me this fight would be a bit different. That's because this boss room was physically different than the ones we had been in earlier. My shoes instantly became wet as we stepped into a wet swamp-like area. This was the boss I was planning on facing on my own. Unauthorized duplication. This narrative has been taken without consent. Report sightings. Where is it? Chance asked. Looking around cautiously, I don't see. Aya. Cece was speaking when she suddenly was pulled away. I leaped forward and jumped into the water only to find that on this level, it went a lot deeper. The first few steps into the boss room from our door were only a few feet deep, but after coming out a meter or so, the ground fell off into murky water below. As I quickly swam forward, a large tail struck me in the stomach, and I found myself flying out of the water and back onto the shoreline. The others were moving forward into their respective positions, but after snatching Cece, the creature appeared to have swum down. I didn't wait to see what happened. Every second Cece was down there, she was only in more danger. I only regretted that I hadn't noticed the red until it had sprung up right under us, and it was too late. Leaping back into the water, I began to swim at a frantic rate down into the murky depths. I wasn't swimming blind, though. I was swimming towards Cece's position. Underwater as she was, she wouldn't be able to breathe. I couldn't breathe either. But I wasn't thinking of that as I swam after her. That was when I saw a large figure swimming in the distance, its tail whipping back and forth. It appeared to be a giant crocodile. I could also see something in its mouth, and that was Cece.